Hello, I'm Cornell Clayton. I'm the director of the Thomas S. Foley Institute at Washington State University. And on behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you out to our event today, which features Aaron Bobrow-Strain speaking about inequality, immigration, and the U.S. Mexico border. This is part of the Foley Institute's semester-long series on the politics of inequality, which examines the causes, consequences, and perceptions of rising inequality in the U.S. and around the world. Many of you know that economic disparities have reached levels not seen in more than a century. Last year, the wealthiest 58 Americans had more wealth than the bottom 50%, or 165 million Americans combined. Moreover, the pandemic, the immigration crisis on the southern border, the Time's Up movement, Black Lives Matter protests, and other recent events all highlight nagging problems with racial, gender, social class, geographic, and other forms of inequality. There's no doubt that the growing severity, both in the realities and the perceptions of inequality, are giving rise to populist politics and social polarization in the US and elsewhere. Our series on the politics of inequality began last month with a distinguished lecture delivered by the Nobel Prize economist Sir Angus Deaton from Princeton University. It will include nearly a dozen other lectures by distinguished scholars and commentators on various aspects of inequality, including today's discussion on immigration and the border. If you'd like more information about this series or any of our events, please visit us at foley.wsu.edu. And if you miss any of these events, you can still see them later on our YouTube channel. Let me also thank the College of Arts and Sciences at WSU for their continued support of the Foley Institute and our programs, including this series. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce today our guest, Aaron Bobrow-Strain, who is a professor and Baker Ferguson Chair of Politics and Leadership at Whitman College in Walla Walla, Washington. Aaron is the author of numerous academic journal articles and at least 3 books: Intimate Enemies, Landowners, Power, and Violence in Chiapas, published by Duke University; White Bread, published by Beacon Press; and his most recent book, The Death and Life of Aida Hernandez, A Border Story, which won a Pacific Northwest Book Award, as well as a Washington State Book Award, and was a top pick for Southwest Books of the Year. Aaron's writing has also appeared in numerous popular venues, including The Believer, The Chronicle of Higher Education, Salon, and The Huffington Post. He has appeared on national and regional NPR programs and been interviewed for stories in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, Fox News, and other media outlets. In the 1990s, Aaron worked for several years on the U.S. Mexican border as an educator and an activist. He is a founding member of the Walla Walla Immigrants' Rights Coalition. Aaron has indicated he plans to speak for about 40 minutes or so, after which we'll have some time for discussion. If you have any questions, I encourage you to send those to me at tsfoley@wsu.edu. Again, that's tsfoley as in Tom S. Foley at wsu.edu. So Aaron, I'm going to turn the time over to you now, and I'll be back later with some questions from our audience.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Clayton, for that lovely introduction, and thank you to the Foley Institute for having me here, and to Professor Elgar for first extending the invitation. It's a real honor to be asked to present in this distinguished series. And you know, I actually have a picture of Tom Foley down the hall from my office from a time when he spoke at Whitman before my time, and I walked by this every day for years. But I really didn't know that much about him. He was at the height of his influence when I was in high school and college, and apparently I may have been distracted by other things besides Congress. But I was coming into this, I was curious about Representative Foley's positions on immigration, on the immigration policies that I'm going to talk about today, because they really have their origins in that ancient time in the past. And I was surprised to learn that while Representative Foley was in Congress, while he sponsored more than 1,000 or co-sponsored more than 1,000 bills, only 7 of them related to immigration, and not one became law. But even with that, one of those 7 bills caught my eye, and it was HR 4447, which was proposed in 1983. And this was an early salvo in the legislative effort to protect Central American refugees who were fleeing from horrific violence that was in large part funded and encouraged by the US government. And notably, among some of its other provisions, this bill would have required an investigation into what was happening to Salvadorian asylum seekers whose cases were denied, which is to say about 98% of Salvadorian asylum seekers in that moment, because we were loath to grant asylum to someone fleeing a government that we were actively supporting with the inflation-adjusted equivalent of about $5 million a day in military and other aid. So what was happening to those people when they were deported back to face the tender mercies of the very government they were forced to flee? This is an important question. But even that investigation, just a little investigation into that question, was too hot to pass into law. And today, as we look at the U.S.-Mexico border, we are very much living in the legacy of that moment. We are denying nearly all Central American and Mexican asylum cases. We are deporting people back to face extreme violence that we've had a hand in making. And then we are washing our hands of what happens to them next. What's, I think, in some ways even more shocking is that today, right now, under a policy called Title 42, that was devised by Stephen Miller during the Trump administration and is now fiercely defended by the Biden administration, we are summarily expelling hundreds of thousands of asylum seekers, such as those Haitians that we saw violently attacked in the news last week. And we are doing this in a manner that is designed to prevent them from even being able to exercise their legal right to claim asylum. And cynically, we are doing this under the glaring false pretense that Title 42 is a public health policy designed to protect us from COVID. That bald lie was denounced really well last week by Dr. Fauci. I can unpack why Title 42 is not a public health measure in the question and answers if you'd like. What I want to stress now is that under the guise of public health, this Title 42 policy has been extremely effective at achieving a long-term goal of the Trump administration, the nearly complete circumnavigation of our legal asylum system. And even as President Biden was denouncing the treatment of Haitian asylum seekers on the border last week, Title 42 expulsion flights were carrying hundreds of people denied their right to claim asylum in the United States back to Haiti, Honduras, and El Salvador. So today, I think it makes sense to ask the question that Tom Foley wanted us to ask. What happens to people we deport into violence, particularly when we are complicit in producing that violence, as we are in Central America, in Mexico, in Haiti? What are our responsibilities in this situation? My book, The Death and Life of Aida Hernandez, that I'll speak about today, tackles a small piece of that question. It's a scholarly book based on 5 years of intensive research, but it was written as narrative nonfiction for a non-academic audience. So I'm going to mostly tell stories today, more than I am going to give a kind of academic lecture. This is a border story. It examines how the border got to be the way it is today and how it could be different. And it does that primarily by telling the true story of one young woman growing up on the border and her harrowing journey through the US immigration and deportation system. But importantly, for today's theme, this border story is also a larger American story of violent inequality. I think, let me slow down here a second, because this move can be a bit counterintuitive for folks who are removed from the border, because we tend to only see the border only just as like a backdrop for national immigration debates. We don't see border communities as real, ordinary places with their own histories, beauty, creativity, complexities, and problems that include immigration, but go far beyond that. Today, I'm going to talk a lot about the small rural border town of Douglas, Arizona, in the southeast corner of the state. And we will talk about the border and immigration for sure. But my main goal is to get us thinking about how that border and immigration story connects with a larger US story of deindustrialization, race, and hyper-intensive policing of people of color. How is it that these two systems, immigration and the border on one hand, and racialized policing in a context of economic inequality on the other hand, come together in really devastating ways? So we open on the border. It's 2008, 13 years ago. We are perched between the United States and Mexico, between life and death, and a Mexican ambulance is speeding towards the port of entry and Arizona. Aida is lying in the ambulance. Her face is swollen and purple. Her arms are torn. She's bleeding from 9 stab wounds in the stomach and torso. And the ambulance races along the latest border wall. Agua Prieta, where Aida was born, is on the left. On the right is Douglas, Arizona, where she lived from age 8 to age 20 until a tiny misstep just a month earlier led to her deportation. And these two towns have been so closely intertwined for so long that some people just refer to them as Dola Prieta, one community united, not divided by a border. Residents who are just a little bit older than Aida remember a time when summer baseball games where home plate was in the United States and the outfield was in Mexico. Language, families, businesses, and cultures have blurred that border every day since the towns were founded. But now it's 2008. And at that point, we were 15 years into a bipartisan border hardening that had driven a wedge between the two communities. Emergency medical transfers across the border were still routine, though, unless something went wrong. And Frank Hone, a Douglas paramedic, watched as everything goes wrong as the Mexican ambulance pulls into the port of entry and unloads. Officers surround Aida's gurney, refusing to let her pass. Family members stream in from both sides of the line, arguing, and someone knocks into the gurney, and Aida shrieks awake. "Please, I have a US citizen son, let me pass." There's stunned silence. Sunday shoppers who are crossing through the port of entry stop to stare. The paramedic sees his chance and he whisks Aida out of one of the most heavily secured spots in the American Southwest. A little while later, Arizona Lifeline 2 lifts off and sets course to a hospital in Tucson. As it rises, it skims over high-tech surveillance towers and what was then the country's largest border patrol station. It goes over the slag mountains that are the remnants of a once vibrant copper industry. It passes the Mule Mountains, and then it soars over the last Border Patrol highway checkpoint, and it breaks free of the border. And the paramedic looks down at his clipboard, and he reads Aida's name for the first time. He's done everything he can do, he thinks, but Aida Hernandez is not going to make it. She does survive. And I won't give away what happens for those who haven't read the book, but weeks later, she returns to Douglas. She is sutured and stitched and twisted by pain that goes far beyond her physical wounds in ways that she has not yet begun to comprehend. And she kneels and she holds her 4-year-old son, Gabriel, as tight as her wounds allow. She looks in his eyes and she promises, "Gabriel, I will never leave you again." And then the hardest part of her story begins. This is a book about the border we've made, about trauma, and about courageous struggles of young immigrants who are fighting for survival and justice on that border. And it centers primarily on the story of this one young woman, Aida Hernandez. And most of it takes place while she's in her teens and early 20s, and she is trying to do the typical things a kid does: finish school, pass algebra. watch Friends on TV, and dream of living in New York. She sets her sights on a dance scholarship, maybe drinks a little too much with her sisters, and she's coming to terms with her bisexuality. Normal stuff. But she is growing up undocumented in Douglas during the 1990s and 2000s, just as policies created far from the border with little basis in the realities of actual migration or life on the border come crashing down on this town, placing it at the center of the storm of immigration debates for much of the next 20 years and turning it into one of the most heavily policed small towns in the United States. She's also growing up poor, which brings us to the larger U.S. story that's underpinning this border story. Let's think about Douglas, Arizona. For most of its history, the border was just a blurry afterthought in Douglas. What really gave this town meaning was not the border or immigration, it was copper and union work. Douglas was founded at the bottom of the Sulphur Springs Valley of Arizona and Sonora, Mexico in 1901, and it was built to be the smelter center for a binational copper empire controlled by what would become the Phelps Dodge Corporation. The smelter boomed through the early 20th century. It blanketed the town with a yellow-gray smog, and it attracted workers from all over the United States and Mexico, with Mexican workers officially earning half the white rate for any given job. PD, as it was known, or just the company, was proud of its paternalistic benevolence, its schools, its hospital, its company store, and it was famous for its virulent hatred of unions. But after decades of struggle, PD workers won powerful representation by the radical mine mill union, and they fought successfully to abolish the so-called Mexican wage. And they made a major mark on US labor history. It started like this. In the early 1940s, a battle over PD's refusal to reinstate striking workers ended up in the Supreme Court. The great jurist Felix Frankfurter wrote the decision, lambasting the company for discriminating on the basis of union membership. And that edict, won by Mexican-American workers, became known as the Phelps Dodge Rule, and it was one of the cornerstones of the post-war rise of organized labor in the United States. In Douglas, the result was 3 decades of rising wages and unprecedented upward mobility. Douglas had a sense of place and purpose in a world and a vibrant Mexican-American working class. This life endured through the typical booms and busts of the copper industry until the Great Recession of the early 1980s and the epochal shifts in the structure of our economy that attended that moment. And then, once again, Douglas played a key role in US labor history. In 1983, PD workers across Arizona went on strike, as they had every few years for decades, figuring they'd tighten their belts for a while and then eventually get back to work after winning a few concessions. But the Reagan neoliberal revolution had emboldened the company, and to everyone's shock, PD fired hundreds of striking workers. The instant response was violent clashes between strikers and police in Arizona, mass protests at the company's New York headquarters, and a solidarity concert by Bruce Springsteen, to no avail. President Reagan's firing of striking air traffic controllers employed by the government in 1981 is usually remembered as the first salvo in an extended assault on labor power in the United States. But PD's action in 1983 was the first major post-war firing of striking workers by a private company. It was a harbinger of the winds of union breaking and deindustrialization to come. So Mexican-American struggles in Douglas bookended 2 key moments in the rise and decimation of organized labor in the United States. In 1987, the year of Aida's birth, PD closed the Douglas smelter entirely and fled to less union-friendly lands. The bad air cleared, the good jobs disappeared, and Douglas was never the same. And as in so many Black and brown communities, deindustrialization and plant closure in this Mexican-American town were not met with elegies or calls for empathy. They were met with militarized policing and mass incarceration, albeit with a border twist. In the space of Aida's childhood, Douglas went from a copper company town to a Homeland Security company town, from smokestacks to surveillance towers. And so growing up poor and undocumented in this context causes Aida's first death, a social death. And what I mean is that Aida is fully part of her community. She's an active maker of it, and yet she is denied real membership in it. She is a citizen without citizenship. She's cut off from rights and opportunities that should be hers. And because of this, we know that she would pay a very high price for the kinds of mistakes that any young person growing up anywhere Aida has to fight for her life literally several more times in this book. But her real journey, the suspense and the uncertainty at the heart of this story, is about a young woman risking everything to see if she can get from that place of social death to a place where she isn't just surviving the world we have made on the U.S. Mexico border, she's thriving, truly alive. Now, there's a lot of spoilers and twists in the books, and I'm not going to tell too much of the story. I mostly want to talk about a little bit about how the book came about and think about the policy context of immigration and inequality that arise from it. So I first went to the U.S. Mexico border in the fall of 1993. And it was the start of a lifelong connection for me to the borderlands and their beauty and creativity and cultural richness. The fall of 1993 was also a pivotal time for border policy, because unbeknownst to all of us back then, a new approach to border security was getting tested in El Paso right at that moment. And it would end up becoming the single-minded center of our whole approach to the border and immigration ever since. By fluke, I actually happened to be in El Paso the week it began in the fall of 1993. Basically, it started like this. Following a Clinton-era INS strategy, the local Border Patrol sector chief pulled his agents off of mobile patrols and just lined them up one after another in one short stretch of the downtown El Paso border. The idea was that by completely shutting down the relatively easy urban crossing points, first with agents literally sitting in a line, and later with walls, migrants would be forced out into the more hostile and mountain and desert territory outside of town. The chief figured that this would make border crossing more dangerous and therefore more expensive and riskier, and that fewer people would do it. This strategy would come to be called prevention through deterrence. And this was the government deliberately weaponizing deserts in the service of deadly deterrence. In fact, a government report from that time says that an early sign of success of this strategy would be increasing deaths on the southern border. Over the next 28 years, we would see the government deploy many new weapons of deterrence, although they didn't necessarily call them that. If they called them anything, they probably used the Orwellian label of consequence delivery systems. In here, we're talking about Border Patrol agents slashing water bottles left in the desert by humanitarian groups, kids dying in cages, the withholding of vaccines from people in detention, deporting women into strange cities at 3 a.m. alone, locking immigrants without criminal records who were pursuing legal immigration the right way in detention conditions that are worse and more poorly regulated than what you would find in a medium security criminal penitentiary. Forcing asylum seekers to wait in dangerous conditions in Mexico, the heaping of criminal punishments onto civil immigration matters. this seemingly like overwhelming jumble of hate and cruelty, when you see things like that today, know that they're not aberrations or the work of bad apples or just artifacts of Trump and or now Biden. They're the results of a 28-year bipartisan strategy designed to make border crossing more dangerous and cruel, supposedly to deter migrants. And while the country's largest and most heavily funded police force is certainly up to the task of enacting this strategy, not all of prevention through deterrence is done by government agents. I'm guessing that whether you like to admit it or not, a few of you have watched the Sicario movies or maybe the Netflix show Narcos. Yeah, some people, okay. To watch that genre, you would think that violent cartels preying on vulnerable women at the border were the enemies of the US government. In fact, by the strict logic of deterrence, they are our allies. They're force multipliers. We have outsourced some of the worst parts of our effort to make crossing the border dangerous to cartels, and then we act shocked by their savagery. So remember this one thing. The border isn't broken. It's working more or less as intended, and that is the problem. Back in the 1990s, the strategy spread quickly. It clicked instantly with President Clinton's desire to take a page from the Republicans' tough on crime dog whistle playbook. Later, Obama would bet wrongly that wholehearted support for this kind of enforcement-only policy could be traded for immigration reforms. And it turns out that ever more spectacular, ever more expensive forms of deterrence and bipartisan political appeal had a bipartisan political appeal. And just to give you a sense of the magnitude of what we're talking about, I calculated for the book that we have spent the inflation-adjusted equivalent of well more than 2 Marshall Plans for the reconstruction of Europe after World War II on funding deterrence-centric immigration enforcement since the policy rolled out. In 2012, the federal immigration enforcement budget, which has only gotten larger since then, but in 2012, the federal immigration enforcement budget was larger than the budgets of the FBI, the DEA, the ATF, the Secret Service, and the U.S. Marshals Service combined, with enough left over to run the national park systems. Let that sink in the next time you hear a politician, as they often do, calling to double the Border Patrol. Of course, none of this achieved its stated goal. Deterrence does a lot of things politically in our country. It does work economically in our country. It's productive for many people and companies and institutions, but we have decades of research now that show that these deterrence policies do not deter migration. Instead, by the late 1990s, what it had done is it began to funnel a continent's worth of migration from Texas and California right into southern Arizona and the border's most dangerous deserts. And one of the very first places this strategy came crashing down in the summer of 1997 was the small twin border communities of Douglas, Arizona and Agua Prieta, Sonora, where Aida was growing up and where much of this book is set. People reeled. Politicians, media, militias descended on these towns. People chafed against the militarization of daily life, the checkpoints, the imposition of new divides, but they had also come to depend on border security and insecurity spending as an economic lifeblood. In 2014, 1 in 7 employed adult men in Douglas worked for law enforcement. A vast border security industrial complex had taken shape. And we often will focus on private immigration detention centers, but it's more than that. It's also the small town budgets that rely on Homeland Security grants. It's the Douglas High School grad who looks at her deindustrialized town and sees the Border Patrol as the only good job left, at least the only good job with benefits and a sense of purpose. Or beyond that, it's the beyond the border, it's the small businesses in places like Kennewick and Spokane, or the county government over in Moscow that benefit from contracts with ICE to provide everything from office furniture to surveillance systems to real estate for immigration detention. A whole diverse way of life has taken form that depends not on improving conditions on the border, but on permanent border crisis for its very existence. A whole range of communities, politicians, companies have a stake now in maintaining crisis. So in January of 2014, I went back to Douglas and Agua Prieta, where I had spent a bunch of time in the 90s, to try to understand how people were living their lives in this new context. And early in the process of my research, a woman named Rosy Mendoza became one of my main guides to the community. And if you've read the book, or if you will read the book, you will see that she is a badass, formerly undocumented social worker who works with victims of domestic violence and sexual violence on the border. And her story also figures heavily in the book. And she connected Aida and me, and she encouraged Aida to tell her story. It took a while for us to meet, and there's kind of a funny story about how we did meet that you can read about in the book. But suffice it to say that Aida and I met for the first time on a wintry day in the 10th Street Park in Douglas, and we sat by the fountain, and she told me her story. And I had not planned at all to write a book about one person, and much less to place violence against women at the heart of a border book. But I knew almost immediately after talking with Aida that she had a powerful message for everyone who looks at the border and immigration from a privileged position, and that our current approach to border security couldn't be understood separate from the myriad ways it makes women's lives less secure. Aida's story, it left me shaking that day in 2014. It's filled with such intense suffering. But the thing that moved me most that day was not the pain. It was the fierce pride with which she told her story, the way she conveyed her story. She exuded this kind of irrepressible brio and wit and power from having survived by the seat of her pants time and time again, having fought against huge odds for a place in the United States for herself and her son. And amid all of that suffering was a message that the sheer act of surviving the world we have made on the border is itself a form of dignity and worth that is as valuable as any privileged person's. That hit me. As the writer Hector Tobar notes, that spirit and that agency is often left out of reporting that portrays immigrants as passive victim props for tragic border tales. And I wanted to try to convey that spirit of agency and wit. Of course, the idea of having someone write a book about you wouldn't necessarily click with a lot of people, but it did with Aida. And we talked about it for months. I wavered, Aida was firm. She'd say, Aaron, I have dealt with the worst possible people you can imagine already, and they have not stopped me. Telling my story is a way to turn all that suffering into something that can reach people and make a difference. And from there, the hard work of research began. Getting a story that's this sensitive and difficult as right as we can meant doing many hours of interviews with Aida, her family, her friends, other people whose lives intersected with hers. It meant cross-checking those accounts with hundreds of pages of school and court and immigration and medical records, listening to court recordings, talking with attorneys and physicians and psychologists and law enforcement officials, community leaders, to verify the plausibility of her stories. And coming into this project as a white man, even as someone with experience doing border and immigration work, I knew that the risk of me missing things, misunderstanding things, or exploiting people's stories was very real. And I spent a lot of time thinking about whether to do this project and how it can be done in an ethical way. And for me, putting that into practice meant carefully going over drafts of the book with Aida throughout the process, making the process as collaborative as possible and having her shape the narrative. Also getting drafts to her family and to many, many other folks who appear in the book for feedback. It also meant engaging with scholars and activists of color through every stage of the project, people who could read the drafts and understand, yes, the benefits of a project like this, but also the risks in a really immediate way. And the question that I posed after folks read the draft was, should I publish this? And the feedback and the encouragement that shaped this book and made it possible. 2 years into the research, Aida and I agreed that we would split proceeds from the book in 3 ways: a third for her, a third to fund work with people experiencing gender violence on the border, and a third for me to cover the cost of research and writing and hiring fact checkers, promoting the book, that sort of thing. In the course of this, whenever we met, I made 3 commitments to Aida: that she could end the project at any time if it didn't feel right, no matter how far along we were. Second, that she would read drafts throughout the process and we'd make it as collaborative as possible. And if she ever revealed something in an interview that was, in retrospect, too personal, she could tell me and we would take it out. These kind of things, along with the profit sharing, are not the norm in journalism. And I did get some pushback from journalists on that. But it's very much the norm in the world of ethnography and activism that I come out of. The third piece was that the third commitment was that I would do my best to portray her not as a demon or a saint, but as a real complex, flawed, brilliant person. And that last piece about messy humanity is central, not just because it's so important for conveying dignity and trying to write a meaningful book, but it also gets to the heart of the message, and it brings together this sense of kind of how immigration and the border and economic inequality are interacting. And if there's one thing I hope that people take out of this book, it's this: that it is impossible to overstate how much our U.S. immigration system, even our sense of the U.S. as a nation of immigrants, turns on this impossible binary between the flawless, quote unquote, good immigrant, the high achieving Harvard graduate, undocumented person who maybe deserves sympathy, and the bad, quote unquote, bad criminal alien who deserves all the punishment she gets. As Rosy Mendoza, who I mentioned before, often says, humans make mistakes, immigrants can't. But Aida's life, her story, does not avow her many mistakes or solicit your pity. If you follow the threads of Aida's death, the one she survived, and her life, the one she is still fighting for, you will see that they challenge those of us who look at immigration and the border and economic inequality from more privileged positions to recognize that undocumented immigrants whose messy human lives don't fit into our good, bad immigrant binary are still deeply part of their communities. They are active members and makers of their communities, regardless of whether they fit into external images of perfection, innocence, achievement. And they are members and makers of their communities, despite having to navigate an almost unlivable world of violence and inequality that is not of their making. I think I'll stop there. I can see questions are starting to come in, and we'll take it from there.
All right, thanks, Aaron. Yeah, I've got lots of questions. Let me begin with this question from John Romero. He asks, he says, I feel that many people do not truly understand the process for immigrants and asylum seekers on the border. What do you think it's going to take for these stories to reach those people?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great, I think a lot of times I'll talk to my students and they think that like becoming a U.S. citizen or becoming a legal immigrant is kind of like going down to the DMV. We know it's a pain in the ass, takes a while, you have to pay some money, but you go, you do it, you go through the steps and you get your driver's license. But in fact, for like the vast majority of undocumented folks living in the United States, there is no line to get into. There's no DMV that they can go to. When Ida was a young girl growing up in the United States, going to U.S. schools, spending her whole life essentially in the United States, there was no route, there was no path for legal immigration for her. And that is the result of a kind of intentional shrinking of the legal front door of the US immigration system that has been going on really since the 1970s, intensifying in the 1990s. And so these are choices we've made about making it impossible for people to go the legal route. Now, the asylum system is something that has been, that is available for folks who are fleeing violence and meet a whole series of criteria that I won't go into now. But we can say that the single-minded goal of the Trump administration in many ways was deconstructing, breaking down and tying up that legal asylum system. And he was very effective at it. So there's going to have to be some restoration of that. How do we get these stories to folks? I mean, I think by telling them, by getting to know more people outside of our networks and talking about having these hard conversations. I do find that the stories are powerful. After teaching immigration to my students for many years, I realized, I can tell them all the immigration facts I want. But at the end of the day, stories are what will move the students to change and maybe even rethink positions. So I do think that storytelling has a really important role in this.
Okay, Carissa Melgrove, she thanks you for your talk. She says she lives in a small border town actually on the northern border, and she sees what you were talking about, the fact that a lot of the employment there is with the Border Patrol and deindustrialization that's taken place there and the consequences of that. But she asks, what can be done to alleviate the problem of a lack of jobs in these small border communities? And, if we were able to move away from the border security state, as it were.
I mean, I don't have a silver bullet for that, but I mean, there are some concrete things that border community leaders are asking for. And one of them on the southern border is that we have put just, as I said, a monumental amount of money into this enforcement paradigm, while at the same time neglecting the kind of the side of borders that has to do with customs and crossing and trade. Our ports of entry are in rough shape. The ways that trade between, say, the United States and Mexico, or trade between the United States and Canada is facilitated, has been largely neglected because we've been focusing so much on this enforcement paradigm. So on one basic level, I hear border community leaders asking for a change in focus. From jobs that are focused on enforcement to jobs that are focused on the cross-border trade, and making that a really building that kind of economic community. That's not a complete solution to this problem, but I do think it's an important point, and it's one of the reasons why these border policies are so enduring, is because so many people have a stake in them, and so there are going to have to be some significant reinvestment in border communities to make up for this transformation, especially small rural border communities. It's not quite the same in like San Diego or El Paso, bigger cities, but in small rural border communities, reinvestment is going to be really important. The good news, if we were to kind of ratchet down the enforcement only paradigm, we would free up quite a bit of money for these other ways of thinking about how to be together on a border.
So Jeremy Camacho, he asks about the differences between Trump's and Biden's immigration policies, and in particular, whether or not you think that Trump's border control policies has affected the Biden administration's policies.
Yeah, great question. And it's definitely an evolving question. You know, there are definitely some interesting signs of what I would consider to be hope and positive change emerging from the early Biden administration. The various immigration reform bills proposed, the 3 immigration reform bills. But even in the past couple of weeks, we've seen the Biden administration doubling down on defending Trump era policies, and that's been really disappointing. And particularly that Title 42 policy leads. I think I get the sense from kind of listening to the kind of inside the Beltway immigration podcasts and websites that there's a lot of conflict in the Biden administration right now. A kind of a key figure around immigration left, and as he left, he was lambasting the way Title 42 is being used. So I think that there's some hopeful signs, but also some really disappointing signs that, in fact, remind us that this isn't a kind of Republican or a Democratic position. The horrible situation on the border that I've narrated is a bipartisan project that goes back many decades. And so, yeah, I mean, and the other, just logistically, it's going to be tough because Trump really prioritized dismantling the legal immigration system. It's really worth noting that Trump did almost, despite all the talk about rapists and murderers, Trump did almost nothing to crack down on undocumented immigration. There's very little in terms of Trump policy or regulations around cracking down on undocumented immigration. Almost all of what he did was focused on dismantling and gumming up the works of the legal immigration system. And he put a lot of effort and had a lot of people on his team who had proposals that they've been designing for many years to carry out this project. He put a lot of prioritization for this. And now Biden has many priorities. And so it's a little tough trying to undo something that was the central focus of the Trump administration when you're also trying to do many other things. I guess that would be my sympathetic vision of what's going on in the Biden administration. But my cynical take is that really we are blowing our best chance for immigration reform in decades. That we've had, you know, with the Senate and the House and the president, slim majorities. Yeah, this was the best chance for immigration reform we've had in decades, and it seems to be going up in smoke, and Biden is doubling down on this kind of enforcement only process. Maybe I'll be happily surprised and some new kind of fountain of positive policy will emerge in the next few weeks, but that's how it feels right now.
Okay, that answers another question from Daisy Jones, who asked what you thought the prospects were that Biden would follow through on his campaign promises about immigration. Yeah. So let me turn to a question from Gus Waters. He says, what would a shift in U.S. Mexico policy look like from a congressional perspective? What are some of the common sense fixes that could be made to the border and border policies?
Yeah, and it's an important thing to note is that immigration policy at a foundational level can only be changed through legislation. Trump, again, passed no legislation around immigration. Everything that he did was through regulations and executive orders and other kind of very effective means, but ones that didn't require legislation. So yes, we need to think about legislation as the centerpiece. You know, for me, it all boils down to, in the end, the fact that we have been narrowing the legal front door into the United States, right? The ability of people to get legal work visas in the United States, to come reconnect with family in the United States, We have been significantly narrowing that for decades without doing anything to change the root causes of why people come to the United States, either what pushes them out of their country or what pulls them here, right? So it's inevitable that we are going to have flows of undocumented immigrants in the United States. If we're making it impossible to come legally without doing anything about the root causes, it's logical, right? And deterrence has proven completely ineffective. So ultimately, this boils down to more visas. I mean, creating a system that allows for more visas for people who are reconnecting with family, for people who are coming here to work, for people who have been living here in the United States, often for decades. The average time an undocumented person has lived in the United States is longer than 10 years. So more concretely, the DREAM Act is out there, various forms of the DREAM Act, and the legislation that is in the reconciliation package has some really good mechanisms around that. There's an interesting, slightly, I would argue, concerning reform around farm workers that would create a path to citizenship for farm workers, but also increase the power of farm worker employers, the hold that farmers hold over their laborers, and the ability of farmers to kind of control their labor force gets dramatically increased by this. But so if you look in the reconciliation proposals around immigration and the House bills, there are some interesting kind of, I think a lot of folks agree, good steps forward that would move us towards that direction of simply recognizing the fact that our nations are, particularly the United States and Mexico, are highly integrated, have been for a long time, and that we're not doing anything to change the root causes of pushing migration. So our immigration system needs to flex to accommodate that.
Yeah, I wonder, even if you fix the legal immigration problem, how would you respond to those who say, well, we still need border security? Mm-hmm. You shouldn't have just open borders. Yeah. So what would actual border security policies look like in a better world than we have today?
Yeah. I mean, the best border security, the most effective border security policies are thriving nations, right? Where, people aren't fleeing from the drug war, for example. People say we have a border crisis. I would argue right now we have a Central America crisis that is expressing itself on the border. And if you start to trace the Central America crisis back historically, it's tied up in 150 years of fruit company coups and economic destabilization, as well as the more recent extension of that into the war on drugs. So I think kind of ending the war on drugs would be a major step we could take for border security. I think backing off from destabilizing other countries is a fairly good border security strategy. For example, it's not surprising that the huge increase in murders in Honduras that has really driven a lot of Honduran migrants to the United States spikes immediately after the U.S.-backed coup of 2009. So I think what I'm asking about is how we think about border security in a new way, right? That isn't about boots on the ground. Certainly, I agree that as long as there are nation states, there are going to be borders, and we're going to regulate flows of people in and out. But I think that a more expansive, what some people, I'm sure, people will call anything an open border policy at this point. Biden is deporting thousands of people, and apparently he's an open border person. But I would argue a more open border is actually a more secure border, because right now what prevention through deterrence and this enforcement only paradigm is doing is making sure that people are surveilled, pushing them out into the most remote and dangerous territories to cross. It is helping the cartels, as I said, by giving the cartels these kind of lucrative, creating this industry of border crossing. So if we had a more regulated border where like people who wanted to cross the border and come work in the United States could get a visa and go through a screening and a background check and all of that and come legally into the United States, we would know that anyone out there in the deserts, messing around out there in the deserts, is probably someone that we need to like be careful of, right? Because we've actually brought we've brought the kind of good immigration back into the legal system. So thinking differently about border security, but with the idea that of course there will still be borders. But in fact, what we found is that this kind of enforcement only, highly militarized border enforcement seems only to help dangerous actors. And that to me and to folks I talk to on the border, that doesn't sound like security. It sounds like the opposite of security.
So Alex Hammond asks whether or not, or how much do you think that the current situation on the border was created or exacerbated by the forces of neoliberal globalization? And is there a way to mitigate those economic forces that push wages down and create the kind of inequalities that we see in the global South?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, if you think about a lot of the kind of the moral panic over the border that kind of marks the 1990s and early 2000s was very much wrapped up in the effects of NAFTA and the displacement of people by NAFTA, as well as the more acute or immediate kind of neoliberal, particularly the kind of the neoliberal financial crisis of currency speculation that happens in 1995, that kind of devastates the Mexican economy, played a huge role in pushing people north to the United States. There's other ways, actually, on the theme of inequality. There's a sociologist whose name is escaping me. I'll try to remember the site and put it in the chat later. But she has a great argument about the ways in which economic inequality, neoliberal economic inequality in the United States is a pull factor for migration as well. Because it's a kind of a two-front thing. One is that we've seen with economic inequality booming in the neoliberal context, the creation of a whole range of employment that tends to be filled by undocumented people. So gardeners, construction workers for that beach house, nannies, so that both parents can be working at JP Morgan. All of that kind of, there's kind of a whole infrastructure of positions that cater to the very, very wealthy that are filled by undocumented immigrants, and then that kind of enable that neoliberal financial system to work. And then on the other hand, there's ways in which the very inexpensive labor of undocumented people in agriculture, for example, kind of allows for the standard of living of middle-class Americans that has been kind of declining over time and losing purchasing power over time, to kind of be able to buy more. I'm not doing a great job of summarizing her argument, but yeah, on both ends, both in terms of the sending forces in Mexico, Central America, and elsewhere, where we've seen neoliberal economic crises as destabilizing factors, and also in the pull factors in the United States that draw people here.
Okay, we have time for just one last short question. This is a good one to end on, I think. It's from Karen Weatherman, and she asks, has the publication of the book impacted Aida's life in the years since its release?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that question. It has significantly, actually. So if you read the book, it doesn't end on a particularly hopeful note. She's in a pretty rough place at the end of the book. And in fact, after the writing was done, she and her son had to go into the New York City homeless shelter system. There's a whole story of just incredible trauma that runs through the whole book. Both her and her son have complex PTSD as a result of kind of growing up in that dual system of inequality, poverty, and hyper policing on the border. that is just brutal to deal with. In fact, our immigration system is designed to produce trauma. So she has really struggled with that. But the good news is that this shelter she goes into is actually had like on-site counseling and provided her residential stability for over a year. She was able to get her GED, and she was able to get accepted into this really cool program in New York City that trains LGBTQ peer mental health counselors. So people who have been through the kind of trauma then become counselors for people their own age, for peers. And that has just been a powerful experience for her. Especially because she was helped so much by Rosie, the social worker, and kind of says that, you know, she really wants to be able to help people since she receives so much help. And actually the book's proceeds were what allowed her to do that training program, because it was an unpaid program. So the book's proceeds were what allowed her to do that. And also, I think she's exchanged, we message all the time, but I remember one message in particular where she, I will send her emails that I receive from readers talking about the book and how it impacted them. And I remember once after sending one of those, she said, all my life I grew up thinking that I was trash and that my country hated me. And now I'm getting messages from people who think I'm a hero. And that's a huge impact in my mind.
Okay, well, that's a good note to end on. Unfortunately, our time's up. Before I thank our guest, let me remind you that our next event in this series is next Tuesday, October 12th. We have Jennifer Sherman, who's a sociologist here at WSU, and she's written extensively about the problems of social class inequality and gentrification in rural communities, especially here in the state of Washington. So I encourage you to join us next week. Again, that's Tuesday at noon for Professor Sherman. Now I want to thank Professor Bobrow-Strain for a really interesting and terrific discussion about the border and border policy and immigration policy. I also want to thank all of you for tuning in today, and I hope to see you all next week. Thanks, Aaron.
Thank you.